In the spring of 1305, Roger de Flor entered Adrianople, wearing the rank of Caesar, one of the highest dignities the Byzantine court could give him. Only a few years earlier, he had been finding work for unemployed soldiers. Now he was tied to the imperial family by marriage and commanded thousands of veterans. Co-Emperor Michael IX received him at the palace, with Michael's wife, Empress Maria, present. Roger sat down to dine among people who were supposed to be his allies. Before the visit was over, he and most of the companions beside him would be dead. Roger's title made the occasion look formal, but it could not make the situation safe. His army had won victories for Byzantium in Asia Minor, then become expensive, politically powerful, and increasingly difficult to control. The empire still needed those soldiers. It also had good reason to fear what would happen if Roger stopped behaving like a servant and began acting like a prince with an army of his own. Michael IX stood on the other side of that problem. He was Andronikos II's son, a co-emperor, and a military commander expected to defend an empire whose resources were already stretched. Roger's success had helped the dynasty, but it had also raised a foreign captain to extraordinary rank. Around Michael were imperial officers and Allan mercenaries in Byzantine service. Around Roger were men whose loyalty belonged first to the company. Roger had not come alone. He brought an escort drawn from the same hard military world that had carried him from Sicily to Constantinople and across Anatolia. But the escort inside the palace was only a fraction of his real protection. The greater part of the Catalan Company remained elsewhere under arms, beyond the reach of anyone who imagined that killing one commander would automatically dissolve the force behind him. That was what made the meeting so dangerous. Roger was not merely a troublesome courtier who could be dismissed from office. His authority rested on veterans who expected him to secure their pay, protect their interests, and lead them toward the next campaign. If he disappeared, the debt and the army would remain. The only question was whether the men left behind would fragment, negotiate, or decide that the contract had ended in treachery. Roger was received at the palace, and a meal began. The setting placed him inside the ceremonial protection of the imperial household, not across a battlefield from an acknowledged enemy. That mattered because the violence about to erupt would be understood by the company, not as an ordinary defeat, but as an attack carried out under the cover of hospitality. Then armed Allans in imperial service attacked. The banquet became an assassination, and Roger's court rank offered no protection at all. The murder is certain. Every private order behind it is not. That uncertainty changes none of what the company could see. Its commander had entered Michael's court as Caesar and would not leave it alive. Roger's companions were caught with him. The attackers had surprise, numbers, and control of the palace around them. Most of the entourage was killed before it could turn the visit into an organized defense. The men outside Adrianople would later receive the story in its simplest and most explosive form. Their commander had entered as Caesar and been cut down while dining with the co-emperor. Roger de Flor was killed there. So were many of the men who had trusted his rank and the occasion enough to enter with him. The murder removed the company's most successful negotiator, the one person who had repeatedly converted military strength into pay, titles, and imperial concessions. It did not remove the soldiers whose strength had made those concessions necessary. From inside the palace, killing Roger could look like the beginning of a solution. Without him, the foreign army might split among rival captains. Scattered Catalan detachments could be attacked before they understood what had happened. Survivors might accept new terms or leave Byzantine territory. It was a brutal calculation, but not an incomprehensible one. Its weakness was that the company had learned to function as more than one man's personal following. Michael Nye survived. Roger did not. The Alan attackers were serving the imperial side, although the surviving evidence does not let us reconstruct every private decision behind the murder with certainty. For the Catalans, that distinction would soon become irrelevant. Their leader had died at the co-emperor's court, and imperial forces moved against other members of the company in the violence that followed. Thousands of company veterans were still armed, organized, and close enough to answer. They had crossed the Mediterranean for an emperor, won battles for him, and depended on Roger to keep the bargain intact. News from Adrianople did not reach them as a change of command. It reached them as proof that their employer had turned on them. To understand how a Byzantine rescue force reached that point, and how its survivors eventually took Athens, we have to rewind to Sicily, where peace had just created an army with no war left to fight. To understand why that murder was so dangerous, you have to go back to where Roger's men were made. Not in a palace, but on the hard ground of Sicily, with their pay already spent and their weapons still sharp. For years, Sicily had been a job that never ran out. Raids, ambushes, coastal landings, burned farms, rushed sieges, and then the long watch for the counterattack. Men learned what kept them alive and what made them money. A lot of them fought the way the frontier breeds fighters: light equipment, quick feet, and a strong stomach for hunger and bad weather. You do not carry a big kitchen when you plan to live off whatever you can grab. They were called almogavars, hard, lightly equipped infantry known for speed and aggression, using throwing darts and blades, dangerous even to mounted men. They do not need a long line of shields. They need space to run and nerve to close. This kind of soldier is wonderful when someone else is paying him. He's a nightmare when nobody is. And around Sicily, when the fighting finally began to wind down, there were thousands of them who had never learned a quieter trade. Peace is a nice, clean word on parchment. On the ground, peace means wages stop. Captains owe promises they can't keep. The men who were told to wait for the next raid start looking at the nearest barn like it's a pay chest. The kings and princes can shake hands. The veterans cannot. If you've spent years taking livestock, grain, and coins from somebody else's countryside, you do not suddenly become a tenant farmer because a treaty says the war is over. So the problem sits there in plain sight. A mass of trained violence, loose in a place full of targets. Sicily's ports and ships made it possible to move these veterans elsewhere. Sending them overseas was a practical way to reduce local pressure. This is where Roger de Flor matters. A soldier of fortune commander who could organize the veterans and take them out of Sicily under a workable deal. He is the kind of man other captains will follow because he can actually get them paid. Roger had a sea-born, hard-edged career linked to the Templars and to piracy and armed adventuring. That life teaches you what a prince wants to hear and what a hungry company needs to see. A plan, a destination, a paymaster. He started doing the simple thing that changes everything. He gathered them into a single company with leaders and an internal system for distributing gains and rewards. A man who fights well wants to know his share will not vanish into somebody else's pocket. Once you have a company, you can sell it. Roger goes looking for an employer the way a merchant looks for a buyer. Someone desperate, someone with money, and someone far enough away that the local farmers can sleep again. And the best employers are the ones losing a war. Across the sea, the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos needed soldiers who could move fast and hit hard. The empire had fortresses and titles to hand out, but it was short on men who could win fights. So Roger makes his offer on the docks. Not a handful of adventurers, but thousands of veterans ready to ship out together under one commander. It is an escape hatch for Sicily, and it sounds like a miracle to a court that is running out of options. The men follow because the alternative is to stay and start a war of their own. They file up the gangplanks with their javelins, their knives, and their battered shields, and the whole company turns its face east, toward an emperor who is about to hire the most effective problem of his reign. The sea narrows, the wind drops, and Constantinople rises out of the haze like a wall built to hold back the whole world. Roger de Flor's fleet comes in by sea and turns into the Golden Horn, the sheltered water behind the city's sea walls. Out at the mouth of the harbour, the heavy defensive chain is there, because the city controls who gets in and who gets kept out. On the quays, dock workers, priests, and board officials watch the ships the way you watch a pack of dogs you might need in a hurry. Because across the water, in Asia Minor, the empire is bleeding. Farms are abandoned. Villagers are walking west with whatever they could carry. A fortress that used to send taxes and recruits now sends smoke and bad news. Turkish warbands are not politely waiting for a big, formal battle. They are riding in, taking animals, taking captives, and riding out again. A garrison that cannot be paid does not patrol far, and a city that cannot be relieved eventually bargains. Andronikos II is sitting in Constantinople with a capital that still looks rich and a countryside that is getting poorer by the month. He can write orders all day. The problem is turning orders into men who will march and ships that will sail. So when Roger shows up with thousands of veterans who already have their own weapons and their own officers, it looks like one of those rare moments when a problem comes with its own solution. The emperor does not need to build an army. He needs to hire one. The price is not subtle. The company expects prompt pay and provisions, and like other hard mercenary forces, it expects profit through the campaign's spoils as well as wages. That means coin you can bite, bread you can count, and a supply line that does not forget a delivery just because the court is busy. Andronikos agrees because he is not buying a new set of uniforms for palace guards. He is buying speed and violence. He needs a force that can move light, hit hard, and make mounted enemies back away from the roads that lead to the sea. The bargain was reinforced with more than wages. Soon after Roger arrived, Andronikos II made him Megas Dou, Grand Duke, and married him to Maria Asinina, the emperor's niece. The marriage did not make the company Byzantine, but it tied its commander to the ruling family before his first great campaign had properly begun. Roger was no longer simply a captain waiting beside a pay chest. He now had a place at court, a dynastic connection, and an army that had arrived together under his command. The unloading reaches the part that makes local people step back, not silk or spices, but men, scarred faces, battered shields, javelins tied in bundles, and long knives worn like tools. Mules come down the planks with packs already fitted, as if this harbour is just another stop. Down on the waterfront, none of the palace favour looks sweet. It looks expensive. Officials count heads in tight little groups, trying to decide what they have actually bought. Dock workers roll barrels and drag sacks while soldiers watch, already measuring how much food is here. And now you see the danger built into the deal. The company comes as a whole. If the emperor feeds one man, he has to feed the friends standing behind him, and the officer who can make them all march, and the ship crews who brought them. It is a moving city with knives. Still, for a moment, it really does look clean. The emperor's side gets a professional strike force without waiting years for training and loyalty. Roger's side gets what every mercenary army wants: a legal payer, official status, and a war that is close enough to reach by ship. They are paid quickly and quartered at Blakeney, and once the deal is in motion, the imperial priority is to get this force away from Constantinople and onto the front, not lingering near the capital's food and money. In 1303, Roger de Flor and the Catalan Company are deployed across to the Asia Minor front and based on the Asiatic side at places like Cyzicus, with galleys shuttling men, animals, and sacks of grain over the narrow water. The company crossed into Asia Minor in 1303 and landed near the ruins of Cyzicus at Cape Artace on the southern shore of the Sea of Marmara. This was not a ceremonial posting behind safe walls. A Turkish force associated with the Karasid frontier was operating nearby, close enough to threaten the district and close enough for Roger to strike before his new employer had much time to wonder what it had purchased. Roger chose a surprise attack on the Turkish camp. That decision suited the soldiers he had brought from Sicily. They did not need months to assemble a conventional field army or a long siege train. They needed scouts, a reachable target, and enough speed to arrive before mounted opponents could disperse across the countryside. The first operation would test whether experience from the Western Mediterranean could be converted into results on a very different frontier. The attack at Cyzicus was fast and decisive. The company caught the encampment before its defenders could turn mobility into safety, drove the surviving fighters away, and seized the camp. Medieval victory totals are rarely numbers to swallow whole, and they are not needed here. The practical result is enough. A district that had been under pressure suddenly had an aggressive field force operating on the Byzantine side, and Roger could point to a victory almost as soon as his men arrived. The victory mattered beyond the field itself. Andronikos had hired a force that came with its own officers, weapons, habits, and internal discipline. At Cyzicus, that organization produced the one thing the imperial government badly needed: a visible result. Roger's standing rose. Frightened Byzantine communities saw that Turkish forces could be hit, and the company learned just how valuable its competence had become to an employer with few alternatives. The company's hardcore included Almogavar-style infantry, described with simple protective gear and weapons like a sword, a short spear, the chuzo, and several throwing darts. They move in loose groups through scrub and rock, eyes down on tracks and hoof prints, then up again to scan the next ridge, always trying to see the riders before the riders see them. The Turks they're hunting are not stupid either. They live on mobility. Riders show up, burn what can be burned, take what can be carried, and vanish into the hills before a slow garrison can even decide who is in charge. Success did not make the company easy to host. Roger's troops settled around Cyzicus for the winter, drawing provisions from a district that now had to support thousands of armed newcomers. Quarrels broke out, including a bloody clash with Alan troops who had been serving beside them. The same cohesion that made the Catalans useful in battle also made every dispute harder for local officials to contain. By the spring of 1304, the next major objective was Philadelphia, a Byzantine city under severe Turkish pressure far inland. Reaching it meant more than winning another surprise attack beside the coast. The company had to move rapidly through contested country while remaining supplied from the sea behind it. This was the kind of operation that could show whether Cyzicus had been one sharp success or the beginning of a real campaign. On the road, the company passed Germe, a fortified position held by Turkish troops. The defenders attempted to withdraw rather than wait for the full Catalan force, but their rear was caught and attacked. It was not the grand climax of the campaign. It was evidence of something more important. Roger could keep pressure on a mobile enemy while continuing toward the city he had been sent to relieve. Near Philadelphia, the forces threatening the city lifted their siege and met the approaching company. The Catalans won again. The importance of that victory was not a chronicler's casualty total. It was the opened road and the surviving city behind it. Philadelphia had waited for an imperial relief army and saw one arrive, but the soldiers at its head answered to Roger de Flor. For the people inside Philadelphia, relief was immediate. The siege pressure broke, and communication with the surrounding country reopened. For Andronikos, the result was equally clear. The gamble made in Constantinople had worked twice, first near Cyzicus, and now deep in Asia Minor. For Roger, every success strengthened the argument that his pay, privileges, and political demands were backed by the only field army consistently delivering victories. Roger made sure the court could see the success. News and captured valuables traveled back toward Andronikos II and Michael IX, while gifts also went to Roger's own wife, Maria Asinina. That name matters here. She was Roger's Byzantine wife, not Empress Maria, Michael's wife at the later banquet. The spoils advertised both service and independence. Roger could enrich the dynasty, reward his household, and prove that the army's victories flowed through him. These victories did not reconquer Asia Minor, and they did not remove the Turkish powers pressing into Byzantine territory. They did something politically more immediate. They made the company indispensable. The emperor had found a force capable of moving quickly and winning. Roger had discovered that each victory made the court more dependent on an army it did not fully command. That was the success the rest of the bargain now had to survive. From Philadelphia, the company moved west toward Magnesia, one of the remaining Byzantine strongpoints in the region. Roger's men were no longer an unknown foreign contingent proving themselves in their first engagement. They arrived carrying pay claims, captured wealth, and the confidence of soldiers who knew the emperor needed them. The military problem and the political problem were beginning to occupy the same road. Magnesia offered walls, storage, and access to the coast. The company deposited much of its accumulated treasure there while operations continued. That decision reveals how far Roger's position had changed. This was wealth gathered by an army in imperial service, stored in an imperial city, yet regarded by the company as its own property. Whoever controlled those stores held more than loot. He held the soldiers' confidence that service would produce a share worth fighting for. The arrangement soon broke down. Relations between the company and Byzantine authorities at Magnesia deteriorated, and the city refused to surrender the stored treasure when Roger's men demanded it. The dispute was not a colorful side episode. It exposed the weakness in the entire contract. Byzantium considered the company an imperial force operating on imperial territory, while the company increasingly treated its victories and gains as leverage against the empire itself. Roger could point to Cyzicus and Philadelphia and ask who else had produced comparable results. The officials inside Magnesia could point to disorder, coercion, and an armed foreign force claiming treasure from a Byzantine city. Both arguments were true. That is what made the crisis difficult. The company was not failing at its job. Its success had given it the strength to contest who defined the job and who controlled the rewards. The same contradiction followed the company through Byzantine territory. Towns threatened by Turkish forces could welcome relief and still fear the soldiers delivering it. Provisions, billets, and disputed payments fell on communities already damaged by war. An army that reopened a road could consume the grain moving along it. The victories were real, and so were the costs imposed on the people the campaign was supposed to protect. Roger expects payment and provisions, and when communities hesitate, the company leans hard through heavy contributions and outright plunder. Andronikos II is far away in Constantinople, But the consequences arrive in the same packets as the victory reports. Requests for more money, more food, more shipping. Every demand comes wrapped in proof. The roads are open, the enemy is pushed back, and the emperor is being asked to pay for results. The trouble is that Asia Minor cannot feed this arrangement forever. These towns have been scraping by for years. Their fields have been raided, their livestock stolen, their young men killed or fled. When the Catalans arrive, they do not see a patient to be nursed. They see a cupboard to be opened. So the victories keep coming, but the mood changes. The same men who cheered the company through the gate start bolting doors at night. A soldier who is disciplined in battle still wants his share, and a hungry army does not stay polite because it is on the emperor's side. For Roger, this is leverage. A few months earlier, he was an outsider offering a service. Now the service has become the only thing that is working. When a Byzantine official complains about damage, Roger can point down the road and ask who else is willing to walk into that countryside and fight. By the time he speaks, his men hold the gate, and the Catalans notice it too. The pay is no longer just a wage, it is a test. Late money means late marching. Missing supplies mean the company takes what it needs on the spot, and the town can argue afterward. They are still doing the job, but they are also writing their own rules as they go. There is another change you can see without hearing a word. The loot piles up. Good horses, bright cloth, cooking pots, weapons stripped from the dead, and coin from whatever strongbox can be opened. A commander who can hand out spoils keeps loyalty, and loyalty is the one currency Roger can spend anywhere. To Andronikos II, that same pile is alarming. A foreign captain is enriching himself on imperial soil, surrounded by thousands of veterans who answer to him first. The emperor needs the company to keep the front from folding, but every week it stays in Asia Minor. It grows heavier, richer, and harder to move. By now, the relationship has flipped. Roger is not waiting for orders so much as presenting the emperor with a fact. This is where the army will go next. This is what it will cost, and this is what happens if the cost is not met. The emperor can refuse, but then he owns the silence that follows. Andronikos still has one tool that can bind a man when money keeps slipping away: status. If Roger is going to be impossible to dismiss, then he can be pulled closer, wrapped in titles, honors, and obligations that make him feel like part of the imperial household, even while he keeps his army at his back. So the next time Roger walks into a Byzantine hall, he does not look like a contractor coming to argue about arrears. He comes in with attendants, with gifts, with the calm stride of a man who has ships at the harbor and hard infantry waiting where the road ends. The emperor's servants clear space for him anyway. That is the new part. Andronikos still had a serious problem controlling and paying the Catalan Company. Cash shortages meant the troops pressed for pay and caused friction and damage in Byzantine territory. You can picture it in ugly little scenes. An officer with an empty strongbox, hard men leaning in for their silver, locals shutting their doors when the campfires go up outside the walls. If you send them home, you lose the one force that is actually pushing the Turks back. If you keep them, you are feeding a beast that bites your own hand. So the emperor reaches for the tool he trusts most: court honor. A dignity like Caesar publicly fixed Roger's rank and forced formal deference in court settings and ceremonial contexts. Doors that used to stay half closed for him now swing open. The guards do not shove him back into the crowd. They guide him through it, and they lodge him where important men can be watched and received. Roger received the insignia of Caesar and was ceremonially vested and acclaimed as Caesar. The dignity came with distinctive dress and insignia appropriate to court hierarchy. Hands lift a heavy embroidered cloak onto his shoulders. A court official adjusts the marks of rank, and the room answers the emperor's decision with a practiced shout that still sounds like surprise. In this world, Caesar is not a job. It is a place in the pecking order, high enough that most men in the empire have to swallow and bow, even if they hate you. It is the kind of rank that clings to you in every room you enter. The marriage was not a second reward added after the title of Caesar. Roger had married Maria Asinina near the beginning of his Byzantine service, when he was made Megas Du. The later promotion completed an ascent, already well underway. The emperor's foreign commander was now both a relative of the dynasty and one of the highest-ranking men at court. Honor had not replaced military leverage. It had placed that leverage inside the imperial family. Not long before, Roger's status was that of a hard-driving adventurer building his fortune. At court, he was now treated as a high-ranking lord. He eats from silver dishes under a painted ceiling, and the men beside him keep their voices careful, like he might take offense simply by being addressed the wrong way. But every gift comes with a bill. If you are Caesar, you are no longer just a commander in the field. You are dragged into arguments about who controls which city, which tax stream pays which troops, and whose seal goes on the orders. And that is where Michael comes in. He is the emperor's son, a co-emperor in his own right, and he is the man expected to stand between the empire and disaster. Now, he has to do it with Roger, standing inside the family, smiling like it is all perfectly normal. Roger's leverage rested on a large, battle-hardened mercenary force, on the order of several thousand, about 6,500 paid soldiers, with more when you count the followers. So when Michael looks at him, he is not seeing a decorated courtier. He is seeing an expensive army attached to a single man, and that man now has a marriage tie that makes a clean dismissal feel like an insult to the throne itself. As Caesar and commander, Roger pressed hard for money and terms, and he traveled to meet Michael in person to discuss the campaign and seek funds. At Adrianople, all of those pressures came together. Roger met Michael IX while pressing for money and preparing the company for further service. He arrived with the title of Caesar, a dynastic marriage behind him, and thousands of soldiers whose future still depended on the bargain he could secure. One murder could begin a war, because Roger stood at the only point where imperial authority, unpaid claims, and the company's loyalty still met. Michael faced the same contradiction Andronikos had been managing from the start. The Catalans had produced victories no one wanted to surrender, yet their unpaid claims, armed independence and damage to imperial communities made them harder to tolerate with every campaign. Roger's elevation had not solved that contradiction. It had made any attempt to dismiss him more politically explosive. Roger nevertheless entered the palace with companions and accepted Michael's hospitality. This was not simple carelessness. Court rank, family connection, and the prospect of another campaign all gave him reasons to believe that negotiation was still possible. Refusing the meeting would have admitted that the imperial alliance had already collapsed. Entering meant trusting that even a bitter political struggle still had limits. The meal began, and armed Alans serving the imperial side were present. They attacked inside the palace, turning imperial hospitality into the cover for murder. Roger and many of his attendants were killed before the company outside Adrianople could intervene. For the survivors, every disputed detail behind the plot was overwhelmed by the public fact of where and how their commander had died. Roger's death therefore landed with far more force than it could have at the beginning of the story. The murdered man was the emperor's relative, a Caesar, and the commander through whom pay and orders reached thousands of veterans. Killing him removed the bridge between the company and Byzantium. At the same moment imperial attacks convinced the surviving Catalans that no replacement bargain could be trusted. This is the part that looks like a solution if you're sitting in a palace. Kill the captain, and the army becomes a pile of quarreling gangs. Pay a few, arrest a few, scatter the rest, and the empire gets its cities back. But Roger had not been holding these men together with charm. He held them together with money, loot, and shared danger. When he died, what snapped wasn't their discipline. What snapped was their patience. Imperial officers moved fast. Across the region, Catalan groups were hit where they were scattered, in billets, in market streets, in temporary camps. Men who thought they were still in an emperor's service found themselves fighting for their lives in the dark. Some were wiped out. Others broke through and ran. The survivors did what professionals do when the contract turns into a manhunt. They moved toward a defensible place, and they stopped trusting every promise that came with a seal. Gallipoli was the obvious answer. It sat on its narrow peninsula like a clenched fist, with water on both sides and the straits close enough to taste the salt. Take that town, and you could block movement, receive ships, and force the empire to deal with you. The company already had Gallipoli as a base, and under pressure it turned the town into a fortified stronghold, while imperial forces tried to squeeze it. Inside the walls, men hauled timber, piled stone, and set lookouts where they could watch the straits and the roads at the same time. After Roger's death, leadership in the company did not pass cleanly to one man. Rocafort, Berenguer de Entenza, and Ferrar Ximenes all held power, with Ramon Muntana overseeing Gallipoli. It kept the army moving, but it also meant every order had to satisfy more than one ambitious captain. The Byzantines tried to squeeze Gallipoli by reinforcing pressures and cutting off provisions coming in overland. On the landward side, patrols watched the tracks and river crossings, and any cart that tried to slip through risked being stripped before it ever reached the gates. Michael IX did not have the luxury of waiting. The Catalans were sitting on a knife handle that pointed straight at the heart of his territory, and they were already sending raiders out for grain and animals. If the empire wanted them gone, it had to go and remove them. So he gathered a field army and marched. Michael IX assembled a field force and moved to meet the company, with a major engagement forming near Apros after the Gallipoli crisis. The fighting came near Apros. The ground mattered. The company did not need to win a heroic duel. It needed to blunt a charge, hold steady, and make the emperor's men pay for closing. They chose their position like men who had spent their lives surviving mounted enemies. The company's almogavars commonly opened with throwing darts and javelins, then closed in to fight at arm's length. Against mounted troops, that combination could be enough. Break the shape of a charge, drag the fight down into the dirt, and turn armor and horses into obstacles. Michael IX survived the defeat near Apros and was nearly taken, saved by his guard. The company's victory confirmed they could beat an imperial field force, and that meant Gallipoli was not just a refuge. It was a base you would have to pay to move, or bleed to move. Now the court's plan was in pieces. Roger was dead, and the cleanup had still failed. There was a mercenary army entrenched on the straits, led by its own officers, feeding itself by force, and listening to no one in Constantinople unless the words came with silver. And once an army learns it can survive without permission, the next question is simple. Where is the nearest countryside that can be stripped for food and cash? From Gallipoli, the road into Thrace lay open, and the company started walking. They did not march out of Gallipoli like an army going to a battlefield. They marched like men going to a pantry. Gallipoli was a hard little fist on the straits, but it could not feed thousands of mouths. Not for long. So the company broke into bands, moved inland, and started taking what their contract used to provide: sacks of grain, herd animals, wine, tools, anything that could be carried or eaten. This was not subtle war. You could see it from a hillside, smoke from a farmstead, a line of men pushing cattle, another line carrying bundles on poles, and behind them the cart that held the real treasure: barrels, salted meat, and whatever coins they shook out of a landlord's chest. If you were a villager in Thrace, it didn't matter that these were once the emperor's allies. What mattered was boots in your yard and steel in your face. Men who had slept in the open for years knew exactly where food hid: in sealed jars, in lofts, in the pits under the floor. They took it as vengeance. Roger de Flor was murdered at Adrianople during a meal at Michael IX's court, and the company answered with ruthless raiding and destruction across the countryside. The hard part to say out loud is that this worked in the short term. An army is a hungry thing, and after Apros there was no friendly magazine, no neat line of mules bringing rations, no pay chest arriving with a wax seal. There was only Thrace, spread out like a tablecloth. In Constantinople, Andronikos had the same problem he always had: money that existed on paper and soldiers who needed it in their hands. He could curse the Catalans, bargain with them, promise them, but he could not make them forget Adrianople, and he could not make them trust another imperial oath. Michael IX faced a Thrace where villages were being emptied and people fled, meaning less revenue and fewer willing recruits. And the company was changing shape. Roger had been a single man you could flatter, threaten, or murder. Now there was no neck to cut. Leadership slid to the hardest men still standing, and one of them, Bernat de Roquefort, starts to loom out of the camp like a man made of old scars and fresh decisions. Roquefort's problem was simple. If the company stayed packed tight, it would starve. If it spread too far, it could be cut apart. So he uses the thing these veterans are best at: controlled violence. Small groups ride or walk out at dawn, hit fast, come back with food, and keep their distance from walls. A walled town could resist them, but Thrace was full of places that could not. Open villages, monasteries, roadside farms, little storehouses by streams. The company learned the rhythm of the land and then broke it. They took the flour before it became bread. They took the ox before it pulled the plough. Some people tried to buy safety. A village would bring out what it could: wine, a few coins, a lamb, and hope the men with knives would keep walking. Sometimes it worked for a day. Sometimes the next band arrived and did not care what the last band promised. That is what happens when an army feeds itself. And the company did not stay purely Catalan for long. Men drifted in the way they always do, toward a force that is winning. Stray soldiers from the empire, adventurers from the ports, even enemies who decided that joining was better than being hunted. The camp got bigger, while the land around it got emptier. Michael IX tried to answer with force, but force has to be paid and fed, and his own men had families in the same countryside the Catalans were stripping. Every time he gathered troops, the question was not heroic. Where do we get fodder, and whose fields do we ruin to do it? So the war turns into a kind of grinding chase. The imperial army comes near, the Catalan bands pull back behind a screen of skirmishers, then swing out somewhere else. A day later, the scouts arrive at Michael's camp again, with news of smoke in a different direction. Thrace is wide, the company is quick, and the punishment was not only for soldiers. When a band seized animals, it also seized the future. Milk, wool, ploughing. When it took seed grain, it took next year's bread. People hid in woods and ditches. People fled to towns and slept in doorways. The countryside becomes a place you move through fast, not a place you live. With provisions and pay failing, captains like Rochefort could keep the company together, but it grew harsher and was forced to seek new country to live off. By now, Andronikos is trapped. If he sends money, he feeds the men who are wrecking his provinces. If he sends an army, it bleeds itself, chasing them across scorched fields. If he tries to negotiate, he has to offer something real, and the company has learned what real means. Not a title, not a promise, but food and silver on the spot. After months of this, Thrace starts to look used up. Not a dramatic, empty wasteland, just a land where every village has already been squeezed, every hidden jar already dug up, every herd already driven off once. The company is still alive, still dangerous, and in some ways larger than before. But now it has to range farther for the same meal. So the camp at Gallipoli stops feeling like a base and starts feeling like a starting line. The bands come in with less, argue more, and look west and north at new roads. If Thrace cannot feed them anymore, then Thrace is no longer the point. The point is the next province, the next rich plain, the next ruler desperate enough to hire the very men who just burned an emperor's backyard. In 1307, the company finally abandoned Gallipoli and moved west into Macedonia. Leaving the straits meant surrendering the fortress that had protected it after Roger's death, but staying meant starvation. The host was choosing movement over a fixed base again, carrying its councils, families, weapons, and accumulated enemies into another part of the empire. In Macedonia, the company established itself for a time around the Chalcidice and Cassandra region. It raided widely, including monastic lands around Mount Athos, and threatened larger prizes without securing a permanent new home. Thessalonica was too strong to become another Gallipoli. The company could devastate territory around great cities, but devastation alone could not give thousands of people a stable place to live. So the camp starts to fold itself up. Cooking pots vanish into sacks, tent pegs are pulled, men argue over pack animals that are not really theirs. A few battered horses limp along, and the rest of the load goes on mules, oxen, and stolen donkeys. This is the moment when the company stops pretending it is still on a contract. There is no pay chest coming from Constantinople, no safe market waiting at the next stop, and no port where they can just buy ship space and go home. Their old commander, Roger de Flor, had been the man who could make a deal and keep the whole machine pointed in one direction. After his death, the company broke into rival leadership, with Rochefort emerging as one of the hard-driving figures who could bully the march into staying a march. Whatever name you put on the man giving orders, the work stays the same. Scouts go out, foraging parties peel off from the road to grab grain and animals, and the column is not just fighting men anymore, because wives and children move with the host and they get hungry too. They follow the easiest lines through the country, the old hard roads where they can, the valleys where water and forage still exist. You can picture the sound, sandals and boots on stone, iron on leather, a donkey braying, and the constant little clatter of knives against belt fittings. In the towns they pass, the reaction is simple. Gates close. Livestock is driven inside. The men on the walls don't ask which side the company is on. They ask whether the company is stopping. If it stops, it eats. If it eats, somebody cries. And the company is changing as it walks. It is not purely the old core from the Western Mediterranean for long. Outsiders fold in alongside them, including mounted auxiliaries from Anatolia, and you can feel it in the camp when orders have to be shouted twice in two different tongues. Behind them, the emperor's officials can write orders and send messengers, but they cannot make the countryside grow back. The army that tried to kill these men has other problems now. And anyway, it is hard to corner a force that travels light and lives off what it takes. So the company does what armies without a homeland do. It becomes a moving negotiation. Every day on the road is a threat and also an advertisement. If you are a local ruler with enemies, you are looking at the answer to your prayers. If you are a local farmer, you are looking at ruin with feet. Unable to turn Macedonia into a secure base, the company kept moving south and west. The route through the Vale of Tempe opened onto the Thessalian plain, a wealthier region with pasture, towns, and rulers locked in their own conflicts. After years spent fighting an empire, the Catalans were approaching a place where their military reputation might once again be exchanged for recognized employment. By spring 1309, with starvation pressing at their backs, the company marched through the Vale of Tempe into Thessaly, close enough to force local powers to notice them and to bargain for their service. They sat down on the edge of richer ground like a blade laid on a table, not swinging yet, just waiting to see who would reach for it. By now, everyone has a reason to fear them. They are hard veteran infantry, and they are notorious for the revenge war they fought against the emperor's forces after their commander was murdered. In the stone halls of Frankish Greece, men listen to that and start thinking like buyers. By the spring of 1309, the company had entered Thessaly through the Vale of Tempe. It was no longer serving Byzantium, no longer commanded by Roger de Flor, and no longer sustained by the provinces it had exhausted behind it. Yet it remained recognizably the same military organization, experienced, mobile, and large enough that local rulers could not simply order it to disappear. On the edge of richer country, it became hireable again. The company's survival was now its strongest advertisement. These men had beaten Turkish forces in Anatolia, survived the destruction of their first leadership, defeated Michael Nafin's army, and crossed Byzantine Europe without dissolving. To a peasant community, they were a threat that consumed whatever lay nearby. To a ruler with a military problem, they were a trained army waiting for someone else to provide its next purpose. The company also had a political structure that could outlive individual commanders. Captains argued, factions formed and leaders were replaced, but councils could still negotiate for the host and distribute the results. That collective machinery mattered now. A prince did not have to trust one charismatic adventurer in order to employ them. He had to reach terms with an armed community that had become practiced at bargaining as a group. Bernat de Roquefort was already gone. He had lost the confidence of the company, been handed to Thibaut de Sepois, and carried to Angevin captivity, where he died in 1309. He could not negotiate the contract that came next. Leadership passed again, and Roger de Flor emerged as the figure associated with the company when it entered the service of Walter of Brienne. The institution had survived another commander. Walter of Brienne, Duke of Athens, wanted military results in Thessaly and lacked a force that could produce them quickly. The veterans nearby offered an obvious solution. Their reputation was violent, but it was also practical. Point them toward an enemy, meet the bargain, and they had repeatedly shown that they could change a campaign. Walter did not hire them because he had learned nothing from Byzantium. He hired them because the same dangerous arrangement still made sense at the beginning. Negotiations settled the matters that kept a mercenary army together: pay, provisions, duration of service, and authority in the campaign. Walter offered high wages and a legitimate employer. The company offered experienced soldiers who were already in the region and needed work. For both sides, the agreement converted an immediate problem into a usable military instrument. Walter expected the arrangement to end when the campaign ended. That expectation was reasonable in principle. Temporary soldiers are hired precisely because an employer does not intend to support them forever. The danger lay in what happened at the final accounting, when military usefulness became an armed claim for money and settlement. The company's captains wanted terms their men could measure, wages delivered, food supplied, and a clear understanding of what would follow the fighting. They had heard promises from emperors and watched those promises collapse. Walter therefore faced negotiators who understood that a contract was only as strong as the resources behind it, and who had an army in camp if the resources failed to appear. Once the bargain was made, the company did what it always did when it was pointed at an enemy. It moved quickly and traveled light. Men in rough sandals covered ground that heavy knights hated, and they brought their knives in close where armor gaps mattered. In Thessaly, that meant hard work in ugly places, villages that backed the wrong lord, roads that had to be cleared, and hilltop holds that thought they could wait out a duke. The Catalans did not wait. They climbed, crept in, and forced gates from the inside. Walter got what he paid for. His enemies fell back, his friends grew bolder, and his messengers could ride without as many ambushes. From the outside, it looked like a clean success story. A duke hires professionals, and the professionals solve his problem. Then the campaign ended, and the dangerous part of the contract arrived. The company gathered for the accounting, because that is what an army does after a job. Men lined up by units, officers demanded tallies, and everyone watched Walter's pay chests like hawks. Walter looked at the crowd and did the same math Andronikos had done. If he paid them all, he would bleed. If he kept them all, he might never get rid of them. So he tried a compromise, keep a smaller picked force, dismiss the rest, and argue about what was owed. To Walter, it probably felt reasonable. Some men had surely looted, some claims were surely inflated, and he had no desire to bankroll thousands of strangers forever. But to the company, it sounded like the same old trick. You win the war, and the man in silk tells you the numbers changed. The men Walter dismissed refused to go, and instead prepared to fight it out, because they had nowhere else to turn. Walter started calling in every friend who owed him a favor. Knights arrived with polished mail and bright horse gear, the kind of men who expected foot soldiers to step aside when ordered. Across the fields, the company tightened its lines and waited, because now the next payment was going to be taken on a battlefield. Walter of Brienne came on in good order, like a man who expected the world to behave. Bright banners, polished mail, and a long front of heavy horse meant to crush a line of ragged infantry by lunchtime. Across from them, the Catalan Company looked like the opposite of a noble army. Men on foot in mixed gear, small shields, javelins, and short spears. The kind of faces that squint into sun and wind, because they have slept outside for years. Walter's army was built around armored cavalry and the aristocratic followings of Frankish Greece. The company's core remained veteran light infantry, supported by mounted troops and Turkish auxiliaries gathered during its eastern years. Walter needed room and cohesion for a charge to break the foot soldiers. The Catalans needed ground that would blunt that charge long enough for their experience at close range to matter. Older retellings placed the battle near the Cephissus in Boeotia, but the stronger modern case puts it near Halmyros in Thessaly. That is the location worth carrying forward. The surrounding ground included marshy approaches, which mattered because Walter's greatest strength was his mounted aristocratic force, and the company had time to choose where it would receive the attack. One tradition says the Catalans deliberately increased the flooding across the approach. Whether every part of that preparation happened exactly as later described, the tactical logic is sound. Wet and broken ground could disrupt a cavalry charge before it struck the infantry cleanly. It did not make armored horsemen harmless. It reduced the speed, spacing, and cohesion that made their charge most dangerous. Walter assembled much of the Frankish military elite available to him: nobles, armored retainers, and the horses that gave them shock power in the open. Across the field stood veteran infantry, accustomed to meeting mounted enemies at close range. The contrast was not noble professionals against a disorganized mob. It was one experienced military system attacking another, with each side relying on a very different kind of strength. Turkish mounted auxiliaries were also present with the company, but their role was more complicated than a simple attack from the flank. Fearing that the Catalans and Walter might have arranged a false battle against them, they initially held apart. Only when the fighting proved real did they commit against Walter's army. Their intervention mattered, but it followed the collision between the main forces rather than causing it in advance. On 15th of March 1311, near Halmiros, Walter ordered his mounted force forward. His decision was not foolish. A concentrated charge by armored cavalry could break infantry that lost its nerve or cohesion, and Walter had brought men trained to exploit exactly that moment. The company's task was to absorb the approach without opening gaps, then force the fight into a range where veteran foot soldiers could answer. The charge carried the weight Walter expected, but the Catalan line did not simply run. As the horsemen crossed the approach, difficult ground compressed and disordered parts of the formation. That did not stop every rider or produce one theatrical collapse. It made a coordinated blow arrive less cleanly, giving the infantry a better chance to hold together through the impact. Where horses slowed or bunched, the advantage shifted. Riders had less room to keep formation, recover speed, or support one another. The company could meet them with thrown weapons, short spears, and close fighting, instead of receiving the full force of an uninterrupted charge. The marsh was not a machine that won the battle by itself. It helped create the fight the Catalans were prepared to survive. Once the formations met, the battle became the kind of close contest in which the company's long experience mattered. Almogavars attacked horses and riders, exploited broken spacing, and pressed wherever Walter's line could not regain momentum. The work was brutal, but it was organized brutality. Small infantry groups supporting one another against mounted men who were still dangerous, even when their charge had stalled. Armor did not become useless, and a dismounted knight did not become helpless. What Walter's men lost was the combined effect of speed, mass, and an ordered line of horses. Isolated riders and men forced to fight on foot could still kill, but they could be surrounded and overwhelmed in ways a successful charge was meant to prevent. The battle was turning from a mounted breakthrough into a crowded struggle of separate groups. When the Turkish auxiliaries saw that the battle was genuine, they entered against Walter's side. Their mobility widened a crisis already developing in the Frankish formation, threatened men attempting to disengage, and made an orderly withdrawal harder. By then, the company had held the main attack. The new pressure helped turn failure at the point of contact into defeat across the field. Walter was killed in the battle alongside many of his leading men. His death mattered because so much of the duchy's military leadership had entered the same field with him. There was no comparable authority waiting safely behind the battle to gather another army. When Walter fell, the defeat of his force became a crisis for the entire duchy. The losses extended through the Frankish aristocratic force around Walter. Men who administered lands, commanded retainers, and connected the duchy's castles to its ruler were killed or captured together. The result was more than a battlefield victory. The company had destroyed much of the network that could have coordinated resistance afterward. The company also suffered losses, but it remained the only intact field force capable of acting on the result. Walter's army had not merely retreated while preserving its leadership. Its duke was dead, many principal supporters were gone, and the mercenaries he had tried to dismiss were still organized. The contract dispute had produced a military vacuum beside the army, best placed to fill it. With Walter dead, the company moved into the duchy and took possession of its towns and strongpoints. Some places could bargain, and others could close a gate, but no surviving field army could reverse Halmyros. Roger de Flor, whose name had been associated with the company's bargain with Walter, became its first leading official in the conquered duchy. The hired army had not gone home, and it had not found a third employer. It had taken the lands of the second, so the guards stay at the gates, and the next gate that matters is Athens. The surviving company now approached places built to obey somebody else's rulers. Below the Acropolis lay Athens with its churches, houses, workshops, and storeyards. Beyond it stood the other towns and castles of the duchy. Their duke had ridden to Halmyros and had not returned. The men coming up the road were not reinforcements sent by a successor. They were the army that had killed him. There was no second battle comparable to Halmyros outside Athens. Control now depended on who could occupy the Acropolis and the duchy's other strongpoints, receive the submission of local authorities, and keep armed men supplied. The company had spent years living from a moving camp. It now had to turn battlefield dominance into possession that would still exist after the army dispersed into garrisons. Catalan forces occupied the principal fortifications and extended their authority across the duchy. The process was not one perfectly documented afternoon in which every treasury, record room, and tower changed hands on cue. It was a transfer enforced by the same decisive fact everywhere. Walter's coalition had been destroyed, while the company could detach garrisons and still put armed men on the road. Then comes the part that turns a roaming army into a government. They parceled out towns, castles, and fiefs among themselves. Many married the widows, and sometimes the daughters, of the defeated Frankish nobles, tying new men to old houses that suddenly needed a protector. 8 years earlier, these men had sailed east because an emperor needed temporary soldiers. Roger de Flor had been murdered, rival captains had fought, Rochefort had risen and fallen, and the company had survived every change of leadership. That history now became a form of government. Individual commanders remained replaceable. The armed community, its councils, and its shared claim to the conquest endured. Athens is where they stop moving. They still need cover because everybody around them has a claim, a grievance, or a cousin with a banner. So they reach back across the sea to Sicily and put the Duchy of Athens under a distant king's protection, trading obedience on paper for the right to keep what they have taken on the ground. Day to day, conquest became guards at gates, garrisons in castles, and new lords receiving the grain and dues that had supported the old ones. Priests still rang bells, farmers still brought produce to market, and the machinery of the duchy continued under men who had arrived with no intention of governing it. Above the city stood the Acropolis. Catalan sentries now watched from a strong point that had outlasted every employer in their journey. Their rule in Athens would endure until 1388. But the reversal was complete as soon as those first garrisons settled in. Mercenaries who had crossed the sea for Byzantine wages now held the Acropolis not as guests, not as temporary soldiers, but as the men who owned the keys.